So now we are going to code the basic authentication mechanism for ASP.NET Core Web API. If you do not know what basic authentication is, please watch the first video in this playlist. Its link has already been mentioned in the description below. The entire code that we'll be doing in this video can be found at my GitHub repo. Again, link of which has been mentioned in the description of this video. Okay, so let's start with basic authentication. Let's open Visual Studio. So any Visual Studio version should be fine, but just ensure that it has you have got the .NET Core installed on your machine. I've got Visual Studio 2022 and it's the professional edition. So let's open that. So once it is open, let us create a new project. Okay. Over here, let us choose ASP.NET. Okay, so let's choose this ASP.NET Core Web API. This is what we are trying to build. You could have chosen core empty, but you will not get the template files. So when I choose this ASP.NET Core Web API, you will see that there is a template that gets installed, or all the prerequisites are already present in my solution. Let's choose this and hit next. Okay, so let's call our solution as authentication types demo, and let's call this as basic authentication. Let's call it as authentication types. Okay, so we are going to choose a framework as .NET 8 for authentication type. Let's choose it none, but if you want, you could have chosen any one of this, but for now, because we'll be building an authentication type ourselves, let's choose this to be none for now. Okay, so all other things should be fine. Let's hit create. So this is what we get. We get a controllers folder which should have a dummy controller, weather forecast controller. You can get rid of this. Let's just delete that, or let it be there for now because we'll be using it. Okay, then we have got this program.cs file. Let's open this. This is where we'll be actually wiring our own authentication with the authentication middleware. Okay, so you see there is no authentication over here added. So now if you want to add some authentication over here, you will have to inject a middleware into it. Okay, so you see this use authorization is there. Just above that, we could have done app.use authentication. What this does is it will add some authentication middleware into it. But we do not want the built-in authentication to happen. Instead, we are looking at the basic authentication that we are going to build. Okay. So now how that will work is with the middleware. So we'll be registering that authentication handler with this piece of middleware. Now we'll see how it happens, as we go down into this. Okay. So first of all, let's so we are not going to write a middleware. Middleware is something we already have. We are just going to add a handler to this middleware. Okay. So let's add a folder. And let's call it auth handlers. Okay, so we'll be adding a basic authentication handler over here. Basic auth handler. Okay, let it be a class. Okay, so if we want to make a basic authentication handler, we will have to inherit from this class called authentication handler. Okay, so this is just coming from Microsoft ASP.NET Core authentication. So you'll have to use this, and then there is this type called authentication options, or authentication scheme options rather. Let's use this. Okay, now it throws an error. We'll have to implement this class. implement this abstract class, okay, and we get this handle authentication async method over here. All right, now let's look at this base class that we have just inherited. If I make a right click and then go to definition, and you could have just an F12. Let's see what it actually does for us. There should be some description over here, and okay, so the constructor over here, it initializes a new instance of authentication handler, and then there is one more constructor, and which says that also just initializes the authentication handler for us, but there are a couple of parameters that we'll be actually needing. So first one is the options, and logger, encoder, and the clock. Okay, so that means when I'll be creating a constructor for my basic auth handler class, and so how did I get this constructor automatically? Just type CTOR, short form for constructor, and then hit double tab, and you will get the constructor automatically over here. All right. So now, what options what dependencies I should inject into this basic auth handler? Now, if you go back to that previous class that we authentication handler type, let's go back over there one more time, and so we'll see that. So this one looks deprecated. Now use time provider and authentication scheme options instead. So instead of system clock, we can use this time provider over here. Okay. So let's copy this. This is something we'll have to pass to the base class constructor. Okay. So in order to pass them to the base class constructor over here, okay, inside this base constructor, I'll have to first inject them into my child class constructor. Okay. So once that is done, let's import this. Okay. So instead of options monitor, okay, so I'll have to do something like authentication scheme options. So these are my options. Okay, so now inside the base, I'll have to pass this options. Okay, and then the logger. Okay, then the encoder. Okay, so the clock. Yeah. Okay, so there's a little warning. Okay, so it's okay. So it's the same thing. It's saying do not use iSystem clock, but use the other thing that was written over here. We can do that later. That should not be a problem because we are not going to. So this clock thing over here, that actually helps you to set the expiry or some kind of those things. We are not really dealing into expiry and other related things. So let it be clock for now, and let's move ahead. Okay, so once that is done, we don't need to do anything else in the constructor. Let it be this way only. Okay, now this is actually something, this method over here will actually be authenticating our user. Okay, so now in order for this basic authentication to work, the request header first of all should contain this key called authorization. Okay, so the first thing that we could do over here is let's check if we could get the request key over here. Yeah, so the request is there, request.headers.contains key, and the key name is authorization. Okay, so if that is not there, what we could do is return, now because this is an async method, right, return a task. So don't worry how I know all these things. I have myself looked into Google and figured out, so that's fine. I mean, that should not be a problem. And then over here you can give out a message, error message like missing authentication headers. Okay, something of this sort. All right, cool. Now let's focus on what actually this method is going to do. Let's add a try catch first of all. So my scope is cleared. I know what things should be coming in try block and the other thing that should be in that should be out of the try block. Okay. So first thing, we need this auth header over here. So again, request dot headers. Now if you see, header is a header dictionary. So if I want to read something out of it, this is how I'll do it. Okay. So next thing is I'll be needing those credentials, right? Okay, so let's get those credentials now. Credentials equal to, now if you recall, before diving into the code, we learned that when we send the username and password, those will be base 64 encoded. All right. So we'll have to decode that over here. So how do we do that? UTF-8 dot get string and then convert dot from base 64 string. Okay, so now we'll need something to hold the credentials actually for us. Base 64 string encoder, or we'll have to create first of all this thing. Okay, now let's use this thing over here. Okay, so now over here in the credentials, we'll get the username and password. And so we have got both username and password. Let's figure out the username is equal to credentials. That should be the first element, or something wrong with the spelling. Let's copy paste the credentials thing, and then the password, that shall be inside the first element. So let's make this as password. Okay, cool. All right, so now we actually check it is basic authentication, right? So if the username, so if this is true, then let's return true, or maybe a success. So this success authentication result dot success, it takes in an authentication ticket. Okay, so now before we actually create an authentication ticket, let us see what are the parts of that authentication ticket that we'll be needing. Okay, go to the definition over here of success and let's see what it takes in. So it takes in an authentication result, as you could see over here. Let's hit go to definition over here and see what do we get. Now, what is an authentication ticket basically? So if we read the description over here, the summary, it says contains user identity information as well as the additional authentication state. So it will have some claims and some claims principle. It will have the authentication scheme information into it. Okay, cool. So let's try to create this authentication ticket now. Okay. So before we do this, I'll remove this claims thing. Okay. All right. So let's call my ticket authentication ticket as the ticket itself, and let's make it a new authentication ticket. Okay, and I'll be needing some okay, so I'll have to go back over there. If I look over here, it takes in a claims principle and then the authentication properties, which would be nullable, and then the authentication scheme. Okay. All right, so let's make a principle, the claims principle that we just saw. Now this claims principle, is going to be a new claims principal. And what does this take? It has got 4 overloads. Let's see. The first one is empty, then we have binary reader, and then we have this identity thing that we need. Okay, cool. So first of all, we'll be needing okay, nice. So this also has got an IEnumerable of claims identity. So if you want to understand what IEnumerable is, you can comment down, okay, and IEnumerable, and I'll make a separate video on what IEnumerable is and what are its properties and other stuff. Okay, let's come back to this very thing. So I need to pass in some identity, some claim identity to it. Okay, so let's create that first. New claims identity. Okay, what about this? So this has got 10 constructors. Again, the reader and then the authentication type. So if we recall, this success takes in an authentication ticket. Authentication ticket takes in a claims principal and some authentication scheme. So we have got the principal over here. Then we need this authentication scheme. Okay, and we need this authentication scheme. We have it, and we need the principal. So we were trying to create the principal over here. Claims principal. Now, what was about the claims principal? We needed claims identity to it, right? What was the other thing? Okay, yeah. So we need the claim identity. Now the claim identity. What about this? How do we create this? What does it take? Okay, we have this authentication type. Identity is something we don't have. Claims is something we can make. Okay, so claims is nothing but so claims are just pieces of information about the user, like its username, email, roles, and other things. Now they are a part of user's identity, and they're used to convey information about the authenticated user. Okay, so we can have multiple claims for a user, for a token, or for a basic authentication. Okay, so we need the claim. So let's create the claim first of all, and then we'll put that into the claims identity, right? So let's create a few claims over here. Okay, we can have a name. Okay, and the name is going to be this username. Okay, so let's keep it just one claim for now. Okay, so now that we have got claims in place, we can pass this to the claims identity. Let's pass claims over here and let's see if it works. It does. And then in the claims principal, we need to pass the claims and the scheme name, if you remember. So we need the claims. Okay, and then the scheme. Let's see. Okay, so let's make it name. Something is wrong. Okay, so we have passed in the claims over here, and I think this took the scheme name. So let's see if scheme name is an option over here. Okay, yeah, so the scheme name should come over here. Okay, and then this claims principal. I think we were supposed to pass the claims identity into it, right? Okay, the principal is ready, and then inside the ticket, we need to pass the principal. Should be scheme.name, right? Okay, cool. So now inside the success, we could pass this ticket. Okay, so this handle authentication async is kind of ready, but there's some error coming up. Okay, let's complete the exception and the summary of this method, like what we are actually trying to achieve, we are first of all looking if the header contains this authorization key. If it doesn't, then we say that your request is actually missing the required headers. So we say that, okay. Then if that is not the case, we come in, we try to figure out if the request contains this authorization header, we try to read it. From this auth header, we try, this will contain this substring basic into it. We figure out that, and from that basic, the value for that basic thing, we will decode it from that base 64 string, okay, and we'll get the string from that. So it will contain two parts, username and password. We'll read this credentials array and we'll get the username and password. Okay, now once we get that, we'll match it against a dummy user and a password value. If that is the case, if it passes, then we say, okay, your authentication result has success, is success, and we go ahead and say, okay, you have logged in or you are authenticated. So we'll now see this. We'll now try to bring this or wire this with our authentication middleware in program.cs. Okay, and we have added the use authentication middleware to it. Now, in order to wire the handler, basic authentication handler that we have just written with this use authentication, we'll do something like this. It says add services to the container. Okay, so what we'll do is, we have got this builder object over here, which is essentially the entire solution that you have built. That is the builder. So builder we have the services collection over here. We use that, and we'll say, okay, add authentication and add me a basic authentication. Okay, we'll see why I'm doing this. And then we do, okay, let me remove that equals over here, and then we do add scheme. And what is the scheme options that we have got over here is authentication, and then we say the basic auth handler that we just created. Okay, and we say the same name that we gave above, we'll be giving it here. Let's copy this. Are there any other parameters? Configure options, let it be null for now. Okay, so now we have wired our middleware, that is use authentication, with this. Now if we look at the overall code, what we have done over here is, now this is our authentication middleware. Now this middleware will process your request and then responds directly in the pipeline, right? Okay, and so how are we actually using this authentication? It is this middleware that is going to invoke all registered authentication handlers to check for authentication information in the request. So for now, we have got this basic authentication that we have built. So use authentication, as soon as the request comes into this part of the pipeline, it is going to call or invoke this basic authentication or basic auth handler that we have created and check for the authentication things. Now this could be, handler that we have added, now this could be a basic authentication, or it could be a cookies authentication, or it could be a JSON web token or JWT tokens, what you call. Okay, so now our kind of setup is ready. Now let's see if this works, right? So what we are going to do, we are going to first use Swagger. Okay, SwaggerJun is already installed when I chose that ASP.NET Core Web API template. So I'm going to run it, and it should bring me a Swagger web page. And from there, I should be able to, see my weather forecast controllers coming up, all those methods over there. So I have given it a build. Let's see. Okay, so the SwaggerJun has come up, but I just realized that my API is ready, but I have not added any authorization headers, or I have not secured my APIs yet. So before testing it out, actually, let's go into this weather forecast handler, or weather forecast controller rather, and secure it. We have this API controller attribute over here, and this is my get method. Okay, the name is get weather forecast, and over here what I do is I can just say authorize, and that's it. So now it should authorize all the calls that we make to it. It will check every request that comes for this get API endpoint. We'll first check if it is authorized. How do we check it? Using our basic authentication, right? So let's build it again and give it a shot and test it. Let's see. Okay, so the build is done, and we have also secured our API. So now let's hit run and try to execute this, using the Swagger. Let's see. So what we'll do is we'll configure our request. We'll add that header into the Swagger and try to hit, this API endpoint. Okay, so before we actually do that, let's add a few breakpoints. Into this basic auth handler. Our expectation is that as soon as a request comes in, it should first come in over here, and then it should go to the get endpoint that is already present over here. Okay, so Swagger is coming. Let's open it up. Okay, so now we need a way where we can actually change or add a header, authentication header to it. Okay, so we don't see that. Okay, yeah, so we don't see that. So probably we'll have to add, configure our Swagger also to use this authorization thing. But now we know that, okay, so authorization header is not present in our request header. So anyways, let's try it out and let's see what happens. Yeah, so, okay, so yes, it has come to this handle authentication async reason, because this endpoint that we requested from Swagger has been marked with this authorized attribute. So it will first come to this basic authentication handler that we have wired with our use authentication middleware, right? So let's see. So we have not supplied any username or password into our request. Let's see what happens. So let's go further down, and it says, okay, headers contains key authorization. No, it does not contain authorization. It contains just these things, right? So it says, okay, this authentication is going to fail, and it says missing authentication header, and we should see a 401 response further. So you see, we did not go to that controller because the authentication failed. And yes, we get response status as 401, that is unauthorized. Okay, cool. So this much is working fine. We just need to configure our Swagger, so that it could be authorized every time we send a request. Let's do that now. Okay, so now let's head back over to program.cs, where we'll be adding the Swagger gen options to our pipeline. Okay, so inside the program.cs, we have got this builder object, and then we have got this Swagger gen over here. Okay, so let's remove this from here, and for the sake of simplicity, save time, I've already, added this code, and I'll just copy paste it. I'll explain you what it is actually doing. Okay, and let's try to build it first. Okay, so it builds fine. So what I've done over here is I'm adding this Swagger gen, and I'm giving it some security definition. What I'm saying is add me a security definition scheme of type basic, whose name is authorization, and it should work with the HTTP protocol. Then I'm adding it a security requirement where I'm saying use the basic security scheme. So this is what I'm doing. So now my expectation is when I hit F5 or when I hit run, in order to test this basic authentication, I should see an authorized button on my Swagger. So let us see if that is happening or not. Okay, so Swagger is about to come, and yes, we see this authorized header, over here. And now if I hit this, I should get an option to enter a username and password over here. Okay, let's enter something. Let's enter user, and in the password, let's enter pass. Let's hit authorize. And now let's try this. Okay. Okay, so my request header now contains this authorization key into it. If I look into my headers, I should see an authorization keyword over here, and it is says basic, and then this is the base 64 key it has generated for me. Okay, fine. So over here it was user and pass. Let us see. Okay, so it got the auth header, and then it got the encoded credentials. Yes. Okay, and now it should give me my username and password. Let us see. Okay, so the username came in as user and this came in as pass. So the username should and the password should match. Yes, it did. Then it got me the claims, and if I look at the claims, I got one claim and the name is user. Cool. Okay, now I should get success response, and it did. It passed the authorization, and then it should come to my weather forecast controller and it should hit my get method. Let us see if that is happening now. And yes, it is happening. And now it should give me this result, this hard-coded result that this weather forecast is returning. So if you recall, we were getting a 401 unauthorized the previous time. And now what do we get? We get a 200 OK response. And this is the response body that we got. Okay. So this is the 200 OK response that we got. So yes, cool. So this is working actually. Basic authentication works fine. Okay, so that is it for basic authentication. In the next video, we'll learn how the API key authentication works, and of course, we'll do a hands-on code for that. Thank you for watching this video, everyone.